As soon as it was ascertained on Wednesday of the arrival in Ferbane of the relatives of the late, much lamented Charles Trench Cage, Esquire, who was so barbarously murdered, the greatest anxiety was evinced by the numerous inquiries of the leading gentry in the neighbourhood to learn when the interment of his remains was to take place, as they were desirous to pay them the last sad tribute of respect. In accordance with the arrangements, the melancholy cortege on Thursday morning, soon after 10 o'clock, moved towards the churchyard, attended by a large assemblage of all classes. The body being brought into the church, which was immediately filled, numbers remaining outside, the portion of the burial service was read in a most impressive manner. The body was then carried from the church to the grave, where the remainder of that beautiful service was concluded. The procession was formed by the mourners, his brother, the Reverend Robert Cage, his brothers-in-law, the Reverend John Stream and Alexander Johnson, Esquire, and his much-valued friend, Captain Robinson. Nearly all the gentry and clergy of the district were present. Taken from the King's County Chronicle, October 1849.
We have to announce the death of Sir St. George Gore, Baronet of Manor Gore, Donegal, which took place on Tuesday night at his rooms in Ness Bank, Inverness. The deceased was famous as a sportsman in various parts of the world. Upwards of 30 years ago, he came to the north as lessee of Tulloch's shootings in Rossshire, and he afterwards held shootings from the late Sir Francis Mackenzie of Gairloch. Devoted to sport and of an adventurous disposition, with unlimited wealth at his command, Sir St. George Gore became desirous of having a wider field for his favourite pursuit, and he therefore forsook Scotland for America, where he remained for years, renting rivers and shooting in the Rocky Mountains and on the prairies. It is believed that he killed more big game in America than any man of his time. He recently returned once more to this country and took a lease of Brain Castle and shootings. He was residing at Inverness when seized with the illness, to which he somewhat suddenly succumbed. Sir St. George was 67 years of age and unmarried. From the Glasgow Herald, 1879.
Two deaths, hundreds of miles and almost 30 years apart, but linked nonetheless. Charles Trench Cage, the land agent, shot outside Ferbane at the height of the Great Famine, and his employer, the globe-trotting Sir St. George Gore. I'm Barrack Hill, and I'm joined this evening by Aidan Doyle to discuss his recently published Blood, Cage and Gore, a work examining the townslands of Endrim and Creggan, the one-time owners of that 2,400 acres, the Gore family, and the global relationship between them. Aidan, I suppose there's no better place to start than that fateful evening in October 1849, and where Charles met his end. What's the background to that story?
Yeah, I suppose it's the background to the story, but it's also the background to this book, and it's maybe where we expand out of. Essentially, Charles Cage was a land agent. He came from Dublin with a legal background, and he was employed by the Gore family. And the Gore family were absentee landlords, and they had land peppered throughout Ireland. At the time of the famine, he was employed by Sir St. George Gore, and Sir St. George Gore, which is a mouthful, I know, and says you don't tell me, ask it, but he owned land in Limerick, Galway, Offaly, part of the town of Ballybor and Cavan. He had land in Meath, and a lot of, and he had also land in Finglas. And Cage was his main land and legal representative in the area. So he'd take care of the day-to-day running of the estate. And as the famine progressed, there's a number of factors that means that evictions rose throughout the famine. And 1849 in Leinster, King's County as it was then called, Offaly had the highest level of evictions in Leinster. And Cage had put in place a series of civil bills on Endrim. Traditionally, people will always say about Endrim and Creggan, the 1100, and even in the reports at the time, they'll say 1100 acres. It depends on who's holding the measuring tape. Later on, when Gore goes to sell it, they talk about a little over 2,000, but it doesn't matter. Essentially, Endrim is a very congested area. There's a lot of people living in Endrim and Creggan, and Cage in September, in the autumn of that year, had put in place civil bills, which is known as the quick, essentially putting in place eviction orders. And we're working forward towards that. So Cage had moved out of Dublin and gone to live on Endrim Hill, what we now call, those of us locally would call the Barrack Hill. And he lived on a house on top of Endrim Hill. Sunday morning, early October, he gets the loan of a horse from a neighbour. He heads off into town for a Sunday service. And as he's heading out of his own area, out of his own, essentially, estate, heading towards Ferbane, he's talking to a man called Cahern. Cahern is one of his tenants. He's also working on the Brosnan drainage scheme. And they pass an abandoned house on their left. Cahern is on his right. And as they pass the house, 2 shots ring out. Cage falls from the horse onto Cahern. He's holding a precision gun stick. He has 11 pounds in his pocket, and Cahern hears no noise. Cage has been shot dead. And there's a number of people seen fleeing from the scene in the opposite direction. And the police come out from Ferbane, and Cage is carried in from that spot, close to that spot. People would often get very particular about where exactly, but close to that spot today, there's a bridge that's called Cage's Bridge. But Cage is carried in from there on a door into Ferbane, and there's an inquest held in the following days. The police come out into Endrim, and on that night, 14 people in Endrim and Creggan are arrested in a sort of a trawl of the area. So that's really the story of Charles Cage. Well, it's the end of his story, but it's probably the beginning of our story.
And just what got to do with the death, stay with the death. You mentioned there was people seen running from the scene, and yet no one was ever convicted of the murder of Charles Cage. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. I want to be, and I've said this several times, and you'll be sick of hearing me say it. I want to be careful because these things are, every house in Ferbane at this stage has the story of a Cage and the story of the people involved, but they all have they have a different story. So,
and that's beautifully illustrated in the book when you have children's versions in a school, some school reports done by kids, and they vary.
Oh yeah, we're very, very lucky. In the 1930s, the Folklore Commission instituted a programme of interviews involving school children in the area, going back to get the folklore. And we're very, very lucky that has retained so much information. But sometimes these stories don't collaborate with one another, if you follow me. But that's okay too, because it's given us if it doesn't tell us everything about what happened, it tells us a lot about what people think happened and how they lived. So it tells us a lot about them as well as what happened. But the great story, I suppose, the story that I would have remembered from being a young lad, was that the 2 people who carried out the assassination fled across the bog, and while everyone else was going to Mass in Ferbane, they were in time for Balnahound Mass, and that this was their alibi, that when the police investigated, that this was their alibi. They had been seen by everyone in the locality at Balnahound Mass, and that the police sent out runners to check this story. Was it possible to get from the scene of Cage's death to Ballynahown in time to be at Mass, and that the runners, unlike the people who carried out the assassination, didn't know the area, didn't know the shortcuts, didn't know the drains, didn't know the holes in the ditches, and that they were unable to meet, to make the time. And that these were the best runners in the police in the area at the time, and they couldn't do it. So this stands up the alibi. Now, I don't discount that story. I'd never discount something like that. But there are other complicated factors, and I go into that in the book. Certainly, there was an effort to use people, vulnerable people in some cases, in other cases, maybe benevolent people, and to try and maybe sort of railroad people in the case. But no person was ever convicted, and there are still disputes to this day.
There's no doubt that the shooting of Cage certainly had an impact on him, but it has also had an impact on Creggan and Endrim and the people that belong to those two communities. You want to talk me through that a bit, Ed?
Well, yeah, I think it's central to understanding how that community views itself. The idea of resistance, the idea of resistance to eviction and things like that. I'll tell you two simple stories. I remember I was doing welding for somebody one day. He was an older man. He just said to me, "It'll be all clear now when that happened. There'll be nothing there, only a couple of big fields." And I just didn't mention it anymore after that, but it was there, and it was in the back of my mind the whole time. The other event is slightly more humorous. I remember being in Gleason's around the 100th anniversary of the start of the War of Independence. A fella says to me, "I reckon the first shot was fired at Cage's Bridge." And it's making a joke, but it's still there. It's something people haven't forgotten, because police were stationed in his house after Cage's assassination. And for that reason, that's why the hill is known as the Barrack Hill. We have Cage's Bridge. So people are very conscious of that something happened. Even if they don't know the full details, but they know that something happened. And it would have been kept alive through story, in some cases songs. When we talk about the Folklore Commission, there was a widespread collection at that time, but the Disarm Church of Ireland school, Wilson, her family would have been from Craig. Her grandfather, I think, would have been a policeman in the area. That's where he would have come to the area. And she would have collected a lot of information about it. But she always called them, the people that talked to her, maybe up towards Glaive in that direction, called him Cager. And she would have collected the song, or poem, Cager's Fate. And only she made that conscious decision to go and talk to people. That would have been lost. And we still have that now, and we might take a look at that.
It was on a Sunday morning between 9 and 10 o'clock that those two young men met Cager and shot him on the spot. Their names will be recorded, and respected they will be, for they freed the 1100 and gave sweet liberty. Brave Gunnan and brave Duffy, they were the only men. They were only heroes, their country to defend. With rifle, gun and blunderbuss, they laid him in his gore. So here's to the health to those two heroes, now and forevermore. So those two young men were arrested and landed in Tullamore jail, and clapped into their weary cells, their sorrow to bewail. So they marched them back from Tullamore, right down through Middle Lane, and they gave 3 cheers for liberty in the little town of Ferbane. With rifle, gun and blunderbuss, they laid him in his gore. So here's a health to those two heroes, now and forevermore. If you were to see the old RIC flying from stage to stage, expecting every moment to get a prey for Cage, but they were disappointed by what they took in hand. He thought to banish all the tenants from their own native land. With rifle, gun and blunderbuss, they laid him in his gore. So here's a health to those two heroes, now and forevermore. So after 3 assizes, those young men were set free. So up stood brave Gunning and gave a great cheer, saying, "All landlords and bailiffs, I'll make them quake with fear. I'll make them fly before me like a hare before the hound, and I will not leave a landlord or a bailiff in our sainted Irish ground." With rifle, gun and blunderbuss, they laid him in his gore. So here's a health to those 2 heroes, now and forevermore. So now that they are free, to America they did sail over. May the Lord protect them on the sea, as he did in the days of yore. With rifle, gun and blunderbuss, they laid him in his gore. So here's a health to those 2 heroes, now and forevermore. So now to conclude and finish, I will lay down my pen. We'll drink a good health to Endrim tenants, for their ancestors are living on there still. And good luck to the men that banished all landlords, and God be with those 2 heroes from Endrim Hill. So here's to the health of those 2 heroes, now and forevermore.
We've discussed a bit of blood, and it's Cage's blood, so we've discussed Cage. But an awful lot of all of this story is around the Gore family, the absentee landlords. And theirs, Aidan, is a fairly interesting and varied and diverse story.
Yeah, it's a story, I just say, like 4 centuries and 3 continents. A very interesting story. And sometimes, and this is one of the things we talk about with memory and Endrim, sometimes people would say, would have remembered Cage as the landlord in Endrim, but he wasn't. He was working for the Gore family. The Gore family did quite well in business in London. They produced a couple of Lord Mayors and things like that. And they arrived in Ireland at the beginning of the 17th century, around a little after 1600. And they went up to Donegal, and they started out in Donegal, and there were several branches of the family spread out across Ireland. And you know, probably the most famous branch, it's not the main branch, but Lissadell House, the Gore Boots and Countess Markridge and people like that, but also the Earl of Arran, and you know, there was Gores everywhere you went. Even though they weren't that big a family, they were very well spread out. The Gores we talk about, they got a baronet for Manor Gore, which is in Donegal, but they would have spread throughout Ireland, and they're the family we maybe look at a lot. They became very large holders of land, sometimes holders of military and political influence, and a lot of this was through marriage. They were very well connected with the Connollys in Kildare, the Hamiltons in Manor Hamilton in Leitrim, people like that. So they're, especially in the 18th century, they're quite prominent in Irish life and quite prominent politically. Their link to this area goes back to about 1710, 1720. The Coughlin family owned a lot of land around here. They would have been descendants of the Mac Coughlins, who were Gaelic chieftains, Killycolligan Castle and things like that. And the Coughlin family went into fairly substantial debt. And one of the people that they went into debt was the Bishop of Clogher. And what I say to people, I've never met a Ralph in real life, but I know every Ralph in history now, because there's so many Ralphs in Gore family history. It's a family name. And one of the earliest Ralphs married the Bishop of Clogher's daughter. And when the Bishop of Clogher died, a man called Ash, the Gore family inherited this debt. And to pay for that debt, they received a large area of land. And Endrim and Creggan was part of that parcel of land. But while they were very good at gaining land and gaining influence, they were very good at spending money too. And they're involved in a lot of sort of economic downturns. They seem to be there. The South Sea bubble, there's a bank crash in the middle of the 18th century. Gore is one of the names on the bank. Some of their family would have invested in canals and things like that, and it never seemed to work out. And they had interests outside of farming and outside of landlordism that were costly as well.
And while politically they were very strong, their business acumen might be questionable.
Yeah, they seem to run into bother anytime they have an investment. And they led, and there's no point beating around the bushes, not just them. There was an expectation on people who were wealthy to exhibit that wealth. And whether that was house building or military service could be quite expensive at the time because people would raise their own regiments. Politics was very, very expensive. There was very few people voting, but it cost you a lot to get elected, and you can do the sums on that yourself. But they were involved in a lot of expensive pursuits, and sport was one of the expensive pursuits that they were.
You described there's a brilliant line in the book that where you say that there's the Gore family had plenty of polish and not too much leather.
Yeah, at certain times they would have run into very substantial problems, and they would have either I don't mean to be rude about this, and quite often they were in heavy debt. Quite often they would use marriage as a way to maybe push back some of that debt. Sir George Gore, sorry, apologies, I'm going to run away with myself. But Saint Sir George Gore, who was his father, Ralph, another Ralph, was a fairly benign landlord, but he spent a short period of time in a debtor's prison at the end of the 18th century. When he inherited the title of the baronet, he decided that he would have to get married, and this was to pay for some of the creditors he had essentially. And he married one of the Farnhams. People would know Farnham houses now, very nice hotel. And some of the estimates would be that over the course of that marriage he would have taken in £40,000, and this was essentially just keeping the show on the road.
And £40,000 in the middle of the 19th century wouldn't be too bad.
Yes, it's a lot of money.
Yeah. Okay, Aidan, I suppose you've looked at the landlordship of the Gores, but can I take you to a line in your book, and it's one that stood out for me. It says, and I quote, "In the case of the Gores in Ireland, there can be little doubt that several generations vigorously neglected the management of their estates, but rarely overlooked the opportunity to have a good time." Tell me how these Gores were having a good time.
Well, there's no doubt about it. They enjoyed themselves. Some of the early members of the Gore family would have been involved in building houses and things like that, but sport is central to understanding, and it's central to understanding the landlord class at that time. It's a big part of life for landlords. And I go back to the 18th century, and General Ralph Gore, another Ralph, all these Ralphs, but General Ralph Gore was one of the people who really tried to establish the Curragh as a centre for horse racing in Ireland. There have been, you're going back hundreds, maybe further, there have been races at the Curragh. But Ralph Gore is one of the people who was involved in establishing permanent structures there, involved in really one-to-one races and winning and losing a lot of money at these races. And that's remembered in song and story. You'd be going along and you'd be thinking, sometimes you'd have the CD, or nobody has a CD anymore, but the radio would be on. Paul Brady and the Irvine come on, and it's the Curragh there, and that song relates to a race that took place in the 1750s, and there are dozens, perhaps 100 versions of that song. But the original line in one of the songs was, the horse was a talking horse, long before Mr. Ed, and he says, the horse turns to the driver, and he says, "And though I was nearing this land before, I have beaten Miss Sporty and broke Sir Ralph Gore." And So there's enormous wagers going on. This is the 1750s. This is 100 years before Cage has come to Endrim. So there's enormous wagers going on. They're spending a lot of money gambling. We're going to have a listen to a song, but it's not that. It's not called Brady, and it's not the Miss Sporty song. And I think the reason I like this song is because it shows you how history evolves and means different things for different people. That song became a broadside sort of ballad sheet. Later on, it crosses the Atlantic, and we believe it was sung in slave plantations. We believe, and it's been modified the whole time. So Miss Sporty is working her way out of the song, and Ralph Gore is working it, and it's modified. And when the Lomaxes went into the prison system in the American South in the 1930s, there's dozens of different varieties of this song, and it's changed from Skew Ball, which was the name of the horse, to Stew Ball, and in some cases Stew Boy. And Lead Belly people like that recorded it in the 40s, and Woody Guthrie, and in the folk revival comes. And the Hollies sing it, loads of people, Joan Baez, but I get them wrong now, Mary Peter Paul sing it, and that's what we're going to have a look at. Nick Kenny's going to do a version of that.
Oh, Stuba's a racehorse, and I wish he were mine. He never drank water, he always drank wine. His bridle was silver, and his mane it was gold, and the worth of his saddle has never been told. Oh, the fairgrounds were crowded, and Stuba was there, but the betting was heavy on the bay and the mare. But away up yonder, ahead of them all, came a prancing and a dancing, my noble Stuba. I bet on the grey mare, and I bet on the bay. If I had bet on old Stuba, I'd be a free man today. Oh, the hoot owl she hollows, and the turtle dove moans. I'm a poor boy in trouble, I'm a long way from home. Oh, Stuba's a racehorse, and I wish he were mine. He never drank water, he always drank wine. Oh, Stuba was a racehorse, and I wish he were mine. He never drank water, he always drank wine.
There's no doubt that the Gores of the early generations had a huge interest in horses, as you have to describe them. But even the later generations had a huge sporting interest, and it wasn't confined to equine.
No. George Gore, who would have been Cage's employer, he tended to get a new fascination in sport every couple of years, and it would change up the whole time. So it could be shooting for a while, dog breeding, hemorrhaging at times. But at the time of the famine, he'd become a very important figure in British sport, because he'd invested well, but maybe not always wisely, in greyhounds. And at the time, hare coursing, 19th century is a massively expansion sport, but maybe as you go later into the century you see more team sports. But say the 1830s, 1840s, the Waterloo Cup comes just outside Liverpool, and it goes across class, the interest that's in this. The owners are quite rich, but the interest from ordinary people in the Waterloo Cup is massive. So this is one of the premier sporting events in Britain at the time, the Waterloo Cup. And Gore, at the height of the famine, has invested in a large number of dogs, and he's the first owner to win 2 years in a row. He wins in 1848 and he wins in 1849. So while famine is taking place in Ireland, Gore is essentially one of the biggest greyhound owners in Britain. And I think the Waterloo Cup is quite an interesting competition. Anyway, it took place until quite recently. Hare coursing was banned in Britain at the beginning of this century. But one of the things, when you try and make a link, sometimes you try and maybe tell a story, just to have a concept of how big it was. And an individual, not a person, but who shows how big hare coursing was Master McGrath. It came a little bit after Gore's time in the 1860s, won 3 out of 4 Waterloo Cups in the late 60s, early 1870s. And people who know nothing about greyhounds, people who know nothing about hare coursing, they know the song Master McGrath.
'69, me in the date and the year. Those Waterloo sportsmen and more did appear, for to gain the great prizes and bear them in awe, never counting on Ireland and Master McGrath. On the 12th of November, the day of renown, McGrath and his keeper, they left Lurgan town. A gale in the channel, it soon blew them o'er. On the 13th they landed on England's fair shore. Well, one of those gentlemen standing around says, I don't care a damn for your Irish greyhound. And another he sneered with a scornful ha-ha, will soon humble the prideier Master McGrath. Then Lord Lurgan came forward and said, gentlemen, if there's any amongst you with money to spend for your grand English nobles, I don't care a straw. Here's 5,000 to 1 upon Master McGrath. Oh, McGrath, he looked up and he wagged his old tail. Informing his lordship, sure I know what you mean. Don't fear noble Brownlow, don't fear them McGrath. We'll soon tarnish their laurels, says Master McGrath. Well, the rose soul uncovered a great English pride, her master and keeper close by her side. They let them away and the crowd cried hurrah, for the pride of all England and Master McGrath. Well, I know, says the master, will wild heather and bogs, but be that in all Ireland, they're good men and dogs. Lead on, bold Britannia, give none of your jaw. Stuff that up your nostrils, says Master McGrath. Well, the hare she led on just as swift as the wind. He was sometimes before her and sometimes behind. He jumped on her back and he held out his paw. Says, long live the Republic, says Master McGrath.
So there's no doubt the Gores had an interest in horses and linen dogs, but in fairness, this particular Gore character brought that interest to the extreme, in my opinion, certainly at the time we're talking about. And there's a whole Scottish period of his life, if you like, when he was almost single-handedly a threat to an existential threat to the grouse of Scotland.
Well, he certainly saw himself perhaps that way. I don't know. I think it must be said, Gore is part of a much wider trend. In the early part of the 19th century, you got the Scottish clearances, both lowland and highland, and there's vast tracts of land that open up, especially in the highlands, because of that. And you've also got this sort of glamorisation of Scotland that comes with Walter Scott and things like that.
When you talk about Scottish clearances, Aidan, I'm sorry now, but that's actually where there are wholesale evictions.
Yeah, and that's a very complicated issue to get into, but there's an economic change, and some of the things we talk about here is trying to understand the economic changes that occur. So what you would have had was from the late 18th to early 19th century, there's a push to move people off the land in large parts of Scotland towards the coast and later towards Canada. And in that case, a lot of the large Scottish landowners, some of whom had been whose fathers would have been clan chiefs before that, they're building up massive debts. And there are large parts of Scotland I won't say uninhabited, but their population is either pushed towards the cities or towards the coast or towards immigration. And also high levels of enlistment in the British Army. And Scotland becomes a sort of, because there's a sort of a highland sort of image, if you understand. It's the place to see, it's the place to visit, and if you're into shooting things, it's the place to go. And George Gore was into that. And
a playground for the rich.
To some degree, yeah, certainly. And like what George Gore would do, I'm sorry for not giving it a full title, I just get tongue twisted, but he would rent the shooting on a very large area. And there are reports coming into the papers, 1845, 1846, 1847. So many grouse shot today, so many stag, so many pheasant or whatever. It's like keeping score, keeping your count. And it's almost as if it's competitive. It's almost as if, I've rented this big shooting estate, the guy has rented the big shooting estate over from me, I'm going to best in. And it's a sort of competitive slaughter, really. And sometimes, and I want to be careful because sometimes I have a tendency to simplify things, but yeah, it's definitely something that sort of piques the interest of people, this large scale shooting, and they're still shooting estates in Scotland, but not to the same degree. But after a few years, Gore, he wants new challenges, and he's a person that doesn't settle. And one of the places he looks towards is America, because previous to that, there have been these great grand tours of Europe and seeing the culture of Europe. But Gore has talked to some people who've been out to the American West, and he's sort of, I won't say he's finished with Scotland, because he's never finished with Scotland, but he's seeing new opportunities, he's seeing places that other people haven't been, and he makes the decision to visit America.
For 3 years between 1854 and 1857, George Gore led a hunt across the American West. fur traders and agents of the US government worried on the one hand that the hunt might aggravate the indigenous population by disturbing their food supply, and on the other hand that the aristocrat wasn't above engaging in illicit trade with the tribes. His hunt complete, he burned a large portion of his wagon train after a dispute with a fur company agents who had agreed to purchase his remaining supplies. Encroaching on land sacred to the Lakota Sioux in the Black Hills, he and his remaining entourage were deprived of their horses and walked to Like a Fish Hook village. The village was a settlement on the banks of the Missouri River, which at that time of Gore's arrival contained the Hidatsa and the Mandan tribes. Hidatsa farmed beans, corn, squash, and were important links in the fur trade. In 1837, the tribe was decimated by a smallpox outbreak, and the tribe relocated from their stronghold on the Knife River to establish Like a Hook village in 1845. The Mandan people shared many similarities in the Hidatsa and had never engaged in a war with the US government. Nevertheless, the byproducts of Western expansion had enormous negative consequences. In the early 19th century, the arrival of Norwegian rats on riverboats who destroyed reserves of corn, and later diseases like smallpox saw their numbers fall from 12,000 people to 300. As a young girl, the Hidatsa Buffalo Bird woman had seen her people relocate to the village. Smallpox was brought to my people here by traders. In a single year, more than half of my tribe died, and of the Mandans even more. Those who survived moved up to Missouri and built a village at Like a Fish Hook Bend, where they lived together, Hidatsas and Mandans as one tribe. The village we Hidatsas called Like a Fish Hook Village after the bend on which it stood. Her son Goldberg described the village. Our lodges were houses of logs with rounded roofs covered with earth, hence their name, Earth Lodges. Fields of corn, beans, squash and sunflowers lay on either side of the village. In the bottomlands along the river, these were cultivated in old times with bone hoes. The Irish landlord spent his winter as a guest in one of these earth lodges. In the spring he made his way to St. Louis and returned to Europe. When the Dawes Act of 1887 allocated land in allotments to its resident tribes, the settlement was abandoned. The remains of the village were flooded in 1953 to create Lake Sakawa. Gore's American legacy is highly contentious, with the baronet claiming a spot in a book on jerks in Montana history. Despite regular attempts to remove it, the Gore name is quite prominent on maps of the American West, with Gore Range, Gore Creek, Gore Lake, Gore Mountain, Gore Wilderness, Gore Pass, Gore Canyon, Gore Trail. High in the Rocky Mountains on Colorado Highway 134, the following plaque remains. Gore Pass, altitude 9,000 feet. Here in 1855 crossed Sir St. George Gore, an Irish baronet bent on the slaughter of game and guided by Jim Bridgener. For 3 years he scoured Colorado, Montana and Wyoming, accompanied usually by 40 men, many carts, wagons, hounds and unexampled camp luxuries. More than 2,000 buffalo, 1,600 deer and elk and 100 bears were massacred for sport.
Scarcely surprisingly, given the lifestyle that earlier you described in Scotland and then KK has elaborated on in America, that the business in the things weren't quite as easy as shooting grouse in Scotland.
No, I think it can hardly come as a surprise. A lot of money going out, not as much money coming in. And I think, and this is something I will talk about a lot with people, and there's no, not to my knowledge, Gore estate papers. But one of the things I would say is, what's quite noticeable, it's my belief, that where the Gores and some of the families like them would have got their money was not as much from rents as we sometimes think, but the concept of a mortgage in time is somewhat different than what we have now. The idea that you get a mortgage, you build a house with the mortgage. At that time you would have property and you would mortgage the property. So essentially the property becomes a type of credit card, and you have multiple credit cards if you want. So you're mortgaging the land. So you're essentially kicking the can down the road to pay for a very fine lifestyle at the time. And this is something that's building up the whole time. And I would argue it was built up maybe for 150 years to a certain extent. But when Gore comes home from America, he spends a lot of time in Britain. He spends some time in Kerry, gets into a bit of trouble down there, goes back to Scotland, and the debts are building up. And 1872, he has to go to the estate courts. And one of the things I'm careful now is that I'm oversimplifying things, but this is a complex story. I don't want to treat people as stupid, but at the same time, I want to be able to explain things. And the estate courts, in some ways, were kind of like NAMA for landlords who were in debt at the time. And he offers all his land for sale, and he manages to keep some of it and maybe get some cash reserves from it. But most of his land is sold to pay his creditors. And 1872, Endrim and Creggan are sold for roughly £15,000, which at the time is an incredible sum of money. But and it allows his creditors to be met and allows him to continue the lifestyle for another couple of years until he dies in Scotland towards the end of that decade.
The sale of Endrim and Creggan is the end of Endrim's connection with Sir St. George Gore. But it's not the end of the Gore's connection with Endrim, as his cousins who emigrated to Australia decided to name their home Endrim House.
In 1841, George Gore's cousins founded Yandala Farm on the Darling Downs in Australia. The Gores were part of a new settler elite in Australia called a squattocracy. These families ignored existing colonial law and the presence of the indigenous population to claim vast tracts of land and build large fortunes. These farms were enabled by the frontier wars, which displaced the local population. As a result, the Aboriginal population on the Downs fell by perhaps as much as 80%. Land and indigenous rights remain important issues in Australia today. In 1854, one of Yandala owners, William Gore, built Endrim House at Parramatta outside Sydney. The Gores sold up Yandala in 1911. Most of the squattocracy came a cropper in the 1890s, following a banking crash and a Federation drought, but the signs of their presence remain. Gore Highway runs through the Darling Downs, where the town of Gore is home to 36 people. In 2013, Endrim House sold for 2.5 million Australian dollars.
It's been a pleasure talking to you to discuss it, and I have to be honest, the reading of the book itself has been very pleasurable. But it's intricate, and you're drawing parallels within history and even current times. You're trying to deal with a town's land and its people, and its people over the history, and you're dealing with one event. It can't, I know history is a labour of love, it's particularly local history for you, but there's a labour element to it too. It can't have been a simple task.
Yeah, well, so you asked me how long I was at, and I was thinking then, like I can remember reading Brendan Ryan's The Land by the River God, and Cage's, there's a chapter on Cage's assassination. I can remember reading that in the back corner in 6th class, and Tony Holler on the same day talking about it, and the idea of that, so like, and so the stories are always there, and the things you would have heard and met, people you would have met, so yeah, I enjoy this, I enjoy talking, we talk about And I will say there's some pretty bleak stuff in this, you know, and not just in Ireland. This is a global story that's focused on Endrim, and you know, things that happened in America, people who, with the result of expansion, suffered greatly. People in Australia who suffered greatly. The thing I would have found when I sat down to do it was that if I became too polemic about it, that I would lose the run of myself. And I have strong opinions now, but I tried. Nobody can fully put them in a box, but I tried it as best I could to quite often put them aside or to maybe tone it down a bit. But it's never easy. It's like Bruce Springsteen would say, God have mercy on the man who doubts what he's sure of. When you're writing history, that's a great bloody thing, because you find yourself sort of double checking, going back on that. Am I doubting yourself? Am I putting that in because I have an agenda to drive or whatnot? And I need to check myself. But it's hard when you have it written then to sort of, you read it a second time and you start to doubt yourself, well, did I take a cop out there or whatever? So it's a very complex story. We're talking about massive issues, talking about debt and aristocratic marriage, sport, how it affects people. We're talking about violence in communities and poverty and things like that. And they're things that are sort of constant, you know. It's never the same, but it's a sort of a constant thing that these type of things stay with us. They're not, it doesn't repeat itself, as we say, but like, if it was Mark Twain that said it, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So it's something I enjoy doing, but at the same time, when the book comes out, I'll still be going, should I put more about this in? Did I pull too easy on that lad? That type of thing. And it's never really over, I suppose.
No, well, in fairness, I think there's a huge balance, and I love that Mark Twain reference, and I do think you've managed to tie it in where there's a volcano in one part of the world and there's a climate change that happens in the 1850s or maybe before, I think, in that case, that affects crop growth in Ireland. And there's a collapse of a bank. There's a whole lot of things that you see. It mightn't repeat itself, but the rhyme is fairly strong.
Yeah, and even within the Gore family, there's a situation where you get yourself into trouble and you try and get out of it, but maybe the ability to step back. When I'm writing it, I'm trying to step back, to try and have that ability to step back and tell a story. But you're never sure. And nobody can be, because it's not an exact science. But you're trying to look at this and maybe pick a few things out and learn a little bit from it. And that's what I hope we did. You know, and that's what I really hope.
Well, as someone who has read it, I think your readers will learn a lot about it. Now, they won't learn much unless we tell them how they can get their hands on it. So, Aidan, when is it for sale? Where can it be got?
Yeah, I'm delighted. This Saturday, we have a pop-up book launch. The Hatch Bookshop will be opening in Ferbane. So people will know Ryan's Drapery beside Gleason's, and we'll be there from 12 to 6 on Saturday. And after Saturday, it will go on general release in the locality, local shops and such. But we have this pop-up book launch. Come to the Hatch on Saturday and we'll sort you out.
And to tie our social media launch all together, you've picked a man who has written a few chapters of Ferbane history himself, Kieran Guinan, with a song he has written himself. Do you want to explain why you wanted that song to be the last bit of this launch?
Yeah, the Brosna River flows, or the small town or whatever. Kieran wrote that song himself. I'm years listening to it. I was always struck by the line in it, and when I started listening to it, I was under the date, but I'm over it now. 10,000 days of small town ways have shaped this, I suppose, but I don't regret an hour I spent where the Brosna River flows. And when you read a lot of history and maybe try and write it, you find yourself sometimes, you go towards the negative. You go towards the things people did wrong. You start to impugn on their motives and things like that. And I'm not a complete romantic. And if you were reading a bit of history, you'd knock it out fairly quick. But that concept and the help that I got from people down through the years, and even on this project when I went to people, what can I do for you? Yeah, brilliant, no bother at all. And that concept that, yeah, we're a product of that history, but as the man says, we're not prisoner of it. I'm talking in sort of gobbledygook maybe business speak, but it's something that sort of touches to me, so that's why we're finishing with that.
So folks, Blood, Gore, Cage and Gore, get it right for you. Blood, Cage and Gore, on sale. Ferbane, a small rural town like many others, has seen shops close nearly every year for a few decades now. For one day only, Ryan's Drapery reopened. Aidan Doyle will be there to sign your name and his on his new book, Be There.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Aidan. What a book. This is a page turner of the highest order. There's no doubt about it. It's a super book. It's a super read. An extraordinary social history of Ferbane and its environs, from Endrim, Creggan, Ferbane, and well beyond into the Wild West, into Australia. It's amazing. The movie has to be next, Aidan. There's no question about it. I mean, it's a credit to you. Well done. The research that went into this is mind-boggling. It truly is. So thank you on behalf of Brosnan Press as well for entrusting us with your endeavours and the huge work that you put into this over the last while, I'm sure. And best of luck with it. I'm sure it's going to be a bestseller of the highest order into the future, and it'll be a document that'll be recorded for years to come. So well done. Thanks for having me on tonight. You asked me to sing a song. I'm delighted to do so. And it's a song that I wrote myself out of my own head there a few years ago. And it's a song about Ferbane. It's called This Old Town. We'll give it a rev, see how it goes. Best of luck, Aidan, and thank you very much. Congratulations on the book. Well done.
This old town is nestled in the plains so broad and wide, where the sweet of cotton grows all along the waterside, and the fields of green they stand in between the heather and the rose, and the water gently sleeps where the Brosnan River flows. It's the town that I was born in, and grew from boy to man. The streets which we played in, the fields through which we ran, and all our lives we have survived the highs and all the lows, in a place by the waters where the Brosnan River flows. Roll on, flowing river, all the stories you could tell. Roll on, flowing river, you know this place so well, and the music of these waters I've heard my whole life long. If you grow where you are planted, your roots grow deep and strong. 10,000 days of small town life have shaped the ice above, but I don't regret I cast my net for the Brosnan River stories you could tell. Roll on, roll and river. You know this place so well. 'Cause this old town is mystery. The plains so broad and wide, where the sweet cotton grows, all along the waterside, and the fields of green they stand between the heather and the rose, and the water gently sweet, where the blossom river flows.
Congratulations, Aidan. Well done, and thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Cheers. All the best. Thank you.